Hello everyone, welcome back to Texas Government. Today our topic is going to be the Texas Constitution. I'm going to do this topic over two parts. So we will get started with this first part in which we will talk about what is a constitution. Well, a constitution is defined as the legal structure of a government that establishes the government's power and authority, as well as the limits on that power. State constitutions function in this capacity for political institutions at the state level. Texas has had numerous constitutions, and they all owe much to the American experience. This means that the Texas constitutions borrowed many ideas from the American Constitution. There are 5 ideals which link the Texas and American constitutions. The first one is political power. Political power is derived from the people. If we look to Locke and Hobbes, who were political theorists, we would see our social contract theory. Hobbes stated, government comes into being when people give up some of their rights and agree to be ruled by a government. Locke took this concept a step further and said, yes, people do give up some of their rights when they create a government. However, people reserve the right to rescind their social contract if the government oversteps their authority. This leads us to political power and the idea of branches. The Constitution, both at the state and federal level, call for political power to be broken into 3 separate branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Each branch has its own powers and responsibilities. However, how do you prevent one branch from becoming too powerful and taking over the other 2 branches? Well, we avoid this by checks and balances. Montesquieu, another political theorist, the one who came up with the idea of branches, says that government can be controlled by separating the power into various branches, but giving them some overlapping functions. So yes, we are dividing our power into various branches, but we're giving each branch overlapping functions so that they can work together. The fourth ideal is that the government cannot violate the rights of the people. The role of a constitution not only states what a government can do, the Constitution also states what a government cannot do. For people to be free, there must be certain rights which exist. The final ideal is the ideal of federalism. This idea is found in the U.S. Constitution. Federalism is a system of government in which power is divided by a constitution between a central government and regional, or in this case, state governments. These 2 different governments share and exercise authority over the same body of citizens. In other words, federalism is simply the system by which the federal government and the state governments work together. Now, the U.S. Constitution guarantees a republican form of government, but does reserve some power to the states. How do we know the states must take a subordinate role to the federal government? Well, in this instance, we know this because Article 6 of the U.S. Supreme Court establishes the Supremacy Clause. Article 6 states, all laws and treaties passed by the national government are the supreme law of the land and superior to all laws adopted by any state or any subdivision. This idea was reinforced twice in history. The first was with the resolution of the Civil War. This indicated that the United States was and would remain a perpetual union of states, subordinate to the central government, rather than a confederation of autonomous sovereign entities. The second way this was reinforced also had to do with the Civil War, and this was passage of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is one of 3 Civil War amendments. The 14th Amendment laid the groundwork for the incorporation of the Bill of Rights to apply to states also, not just the federal government. The U.S. Constitution establishes the Supremacy Clause, of course, but also has the Necessary and Proper Clause, and we find this in Article 1, Section 8. This article and section gives Congress the authority to make all laws which are necessary and proper to carry out Congress's expressed powers. This clause provided a constitutional basis for the expansion of central government power in the federal system. As I said, this clause provided a constitutional basis for the expansion of central government power in the federal system. The writers of the current Texas Constitution were reluctant to provide such broad discretionary power to the state government. Thus, we have the federal Constitution, which gives powers to the federal government and leaves other powers to the state. We have established the federal government has power and the states have power, but is there a big, bright dividing line between the two, between the federal and the state? Is there something which says, federal government, you can do this, and states, you can do that? No, there is not. So how do we know if a federal act violates states' rights, or if a state act violates the U.S. Constitution? The Supreme Court must rule on it. So the question becomes, why is the Supreme Court decision the final answer? Well, please make a note of the question and we will find out later on in the future topics. But I'm sure some of you have ideas of why this is, so please make note and save them for our discussions online. Now we come to the listing and the studying of the previous Texas constitutions. First and foremost, during the history of Texas as a territory, nation, and state, we have been governed by 7 constitutions. Each constitution was shaped by the political climate of the day and a desire to rectify problems with the previous systems of governance. The first constitution is called the Constitution of Coahuila y Texas. In spite of attempts at rebellion in the early 1800s, Texas remained a part of New Spain until the Mexican War of Independence. This was sparked by Spain's massive extraction of wealth from the colonies during the Napoleonic Wars. After a series of revolts and guerrilla attacks, Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821. Because Texas was a part of Mexico, it first operated under the Republic of Mexico's Constitution of 1824. At the national level, this constitution was federalist in concept, dividing governing authority between the nation and the states, breaking with Spanish centralist tradition of a strong national government. It created a bicameral legislature and a Supreme Court. The president and vice president were elected by the state legislatures. Local affairs remained independent of the central government. It was similar to the American Constitution, except that Catholicism was established as the national religion. Under the provisions of the 1824 Constitution, the state of Coahuila y Texas was formed. The new state was required to enact a state constitution. The Constitution of Coahuila y Texas was passed in 1827, making this the first constitution of what was then the Texas Territory. The state constitution divided the state into 3 separate districts. Legislative powers were given to a unicameral legislature of 12 deputies elected by the people. Executive power was vested in a governor and vice governor who served 4-year terms. Judicial power was placed in state courts. This constitution guaranteed citizens the right to liberty, security, property, and equality. The disagreeable sections included designating Catholicism as the state religion and not recognizing slavery. There are a couple of other ideas which came from being a part and governed under the Mexican Constitution. The first idea was that of a homestead exemption from bankruptcy. Remember, Texas was a big state and not very well populated at this time. Stephen F. Austin recommended this idea to the state legislature of Coahuila y Texas. Stephen F. Austin also recommended a moratorium be placed on the collection of Anglo-colonist debt to foreign creditors. This means if Anglos came from the United States to start a new life in Texas, any homestead property created in Texas could not be seized to pay their debt back in the United States. In other words, if you came from one of the U.S. states, say you moved from Virginia to what was then the territory of Texas, what was then Coahuila y Texas, you bought property in this new territory. The people that you owed money to back in Virginia could not come after your new property. The other idea was the idea of communal property. What is communal property? Well, this, of course, applies to the property that is owned by a couple, a married couple. So the idea of communal property is that it is owned equally by both parties. The last thing this Constitution did was promote education. While never addressing a statewide school system, it would be the subject of intense interest in subsequent constitutional conventions. Our next constitution is the Constitution of 1836. Texas's break with Mexico was the culmination of a growing sense of discontent over its place in the federal system. Among other things, Texas demanded liberalized immigration policies and English and Spanish-speaking schools. Everyone who immigrated to Mexico had to become a Mexican citizen and follow all rules. There were no choices like we have today. Texas was pushed closer to a rebellion against the central Mexican government by the imprisonment of Stephen F. Austin when he proposed a new constitution to the Mexican government. The 1836 Constitutional Convention at Washington on the Brazos declared independence from Mexican military and religious tyranny. Borrowing heavily from Locke and Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence included a list of grievances against Mexico, arguing that the government had abdicated its duties. The new Constitution was brief, less than 6,500 words, and flexible. It established a unitary form of government rather than a federal form of government. An elected chief executive or president with limited terms, a bicameral legislature, and a four-tiered judicial system composed of justice, county, district, and Supreme Courts was the type of government that they wanted and established. Power was divided among these three institutions, and a system of checks and balances was put into place. Amendments were difficult to make, although a Bill of Rights was included. The Constitution also legalized slavery, included freedom of religion, and property rights protections. Now, while the 1836 Constitution called for Texas to join the United States, Texas remained an independent republic for 9 years. The primary roadblock to annexation was the concern that Texas would enter the Union as a slave state, disrupting an already delicate balance. Moreover, some feared the possibility that annexation would spark a war with Mexico. In 1845, however, Congress passed a resolution allowing for annexation. A new state constitution was drafted, reflecting the traditionalistic Southern culture, with a few notable exceptions. The new constitution was twice as long as the previous constitution and included the following provisions. 1. Women were granted property rights equal to those of men, especially in marriage, where women were given half the value of all property acquired during marriage. This is also known as communal property. 2. A person's homestead was protected from forced sale to pay debts. 3. There was limited executive authority. The fourth is that biennial sessions of the bicameral legislature were enacted. Fifth, 2-year terms for most officials became the norm. And sixth, an appointed judiciary comprised of a Supreme Court, district courts, and lower courts made up the judicial system. Under the Constitution of 1845, other appointment powers given to the governor included the power to appoint the state attorney general and the secretary of state. All appointments were subject to the approval of the Texas Senate. However, the comptroller of public accounts and the treasurer were elected every 2 years by a joint session of the legislature. Amending the Constitution remained difficult. Among other provisions, the Constitution allowed for Texas to divide itself into as many as 5 states. It required the state to pay its foreign debts, and it allowed Texas to retain title to its public lands, which could be sold to pay the debt. At this point in time, the state of Texas had fiscal conservatism. The Constitution stated the total accumulated state debt could be no more than $100,000 with some exceptions. Those exceptions were in the case of war, insurrection, or invasion. We come now to 1861. What issue caused Texas to leave the Union and join the Confederacy? Slavery had become a vital institution to the Texas economy, and slaves made up 30% of the state's population. Pressure to secede mounted after Abraham Lincoln was elected president. But the question of secession divided Texas along regional, ethnic, and partisan lines. Governor Sam Houston did not support secession, but he was bypassed by a convention of lawyers and slaveholders. Texas voters approved secession in February of 1861. A new constitution was drafted. This constitution stated that it was protecting the institution of slavery, and the references made to the United States of America were replaced, and they were replaced with references to the Confederate States of America. And thus, Texas joins the Confederate States and joins the Civil War. This, of course, moves us to the Constitution of 1866. After the defeat of the South in the Civil War, the renegade states had to write new constitutions to be allowed back into the Union. The structure of government outlined in the new Constitution was similar to what had been established in 1845 and 1861. The new Constitution nullified the ordinances of secession. The state lost the right to secede in the future, and repudiated work debts incurred by the state, and included the abolition of slavery. This Constitution granted the Constitution of 1866 granted freedmen rights to their persons and property. It gave them the right to sue, be sued, and contract with others. But they were denied suffrage and the right to hold public office. This Constitution also raised the salaries of the state public officers. Basically, all the changes were very small in stature, with the most notable changes being the governor's term changed from 2 years to 4 years. The Constitution changed the method of selection of the comptroller and the treasurer to popular election, and created jurisdictions of the various courts of the state. The state now moves forward to the Reconstruction era. In 1869, a constitutional convention assembled in Texas to meet the requirements of the Congressional Reconstruction Acts of 1867. Democrats were opposed to the conventions, but radical Republicans, a bloc of Republicans in the U.S. Congress who pushed through the adoption of black suffrage, as well as an extended period of military occupation in the South following the Civil War, easily won. certain features of the 1869 Constitution stand out. It is in this Constitution of 1869 that the U.S. Constitution was declared the supreme law of the land. Slavery was forbidden, and blacks were given the right to vote. The 14th Amendment guarantees of equality before the law were recognized. Also, the three branches of government were altered. The number of legislators was changed. The executive branch was given more power, especially with respect to appointments. The size of the Supreme Court was reduced, and finally, state official salaries were increased. The new Constitution went into effect after it was published under order of military officials. Edmund Davis, a Republican and former Union general, served as governor under the new Constitution. Some have argued that his administration was corrupt and extravagant, and that he used the state police and the militia to maintain the regime. However, in this Constitution of 1869, we did see an activist agenda. Schools were a higher priority, and the existing school fund was to be financed by receipts from a new poll tax, plus 1/4 of annual taxes, plus income from land set aside to support schools. In other words, public schools were centralized under state control. The position of the State Superintendent of Public Instruction was maintained, and school attendance was made mandatory. Some of the other things the Constitution of 1869 included were that whites who participated in the rebellion were disfranchised, meaning whites who participated in the Civil War lost their right to vote. This Constitution also established an immigration bureau. It established no fee granting of homesteads. It assigned mineral rights to landowners. It forbade the legislature from authorizing lotteries or granting divorces. It also authorized the legislature to prohibit the sale of liquor near colleges. Remember, a number of Democrats did not participate in the creation of this Constitution. They were either irked at the Republicans or were not allowed to participate in government because the Republicans at the national level would not allow former Southern officers to be politicians. The officers were politicians before they went into the Confederate Army, so we had nobody with political experience to be a leader at this point. In 1872, Democrats gained control of state government, and Richard Koch was elected governor. Okay, so this is where we will stop for this part 1 of the Texas Constitutions. Please note that we will start up the next part with what is now the current Constitution, the Constitution of 1876. Please review this first part. Let me know if you have any questions. Reach out to me and I will be more than happy to answer or clarify anything. Until then, you guys have a good one and y'all stay safe. Bye.